Cuba is a very touchy subject. I try to do my best to go after some of the dynamics of the U.S.-Cuba relations, going, as you can see from my title, the past, the present, and the future. I will talk very briefly about the past, and then I will move quickly on more recent issues. This is the island of Cuba. It's a relatively big island, 11.3, 11.4 million people. Between the southern part of Florida, the Keys, and the northern part of Cuba, there are about 90, 100 miles. So it's very close. Obviously, there has not been a normal relationship with Cuba for the past 50 years. There have been several problems that I will be talking about. Sometimes when I do travel to Cuba, which I do on a regular basis, I do wonder when I drive my car going to Miami and picking up a flight there, probably if it wouldn't be for the embargo or for the kind of relationship that has been established between the two countries, I would be probably driving to Cuba by now with a bridge and connected the southern part of Florida and the northern part of Cuba. Something about the relationship, first of all, conflictual over time. Next January 2009 is going to be the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. So we are talking about 50 years of a communist government in Cuba. Obviously, most of you know that Fidel Castro relinquished power about a month and a half ago to his brother Raul. He fell ill at the end of July 2006. Since that time, his brother Raul Castro has been ruling the island and now officially is the new president. Cuba is very special. It's the only country in Latin America that is not considered a democracy. For that reason, does not participate to most trade agreement, is not a part of the IMF or the World Bank, because Cuba, as I said, is not a democracy. One of the things that I'm going to talk about today is also the role of Florida, in particular the Cuban American community, and what kind of impact might have on US policy. Briefly on the Cold War period, so the Cuban Revolution was January 1959. There have been different times. During the Carter administration, 1977 was the opening of the intersections, both in Havana and Washington, D.C. There is not a full diplomatic relationship, but those intersections, which, by the way, are in the building of the Swiss embassy, both in Havana and in Washington, more or less have created a sort of contact between the two countries, but they are not full diplomatic relationship, the one they have. Something about, since I don't want to waste too much time on the history of the relationship. The post-Cold War period, what happened in the early 90s? First of all, Cuba was no longer supporting revolutionary movements in Latin America. Cuba no longer had a special relationship with the Soviet Union, lost all the subsidies coming from the Soviet Union. Cuba no longer was involved in Africa, in several wars there. So we would have expected perhaps a relaxation and a better relationship with the United States, considering also the new international scenario at that time. Also in the Americas, many countries in America were transitioning to more democratic forms of government. What the United States decided to do, by the way, the United States has an embargo on Cuba since 1962, a full embargo, although a few months after the revolution, already by April 1959, the United States decided to cut the sugar quota in the United States. So there was an incremental series of measures leading to a full embargo by 1962. I can tell you in the 90s the embargo was strengthened significantly with two major legislation, the 1992 Torricelli Law and the 1996 Helms-Burton Law, which is the latest package, comprehensive package of sanctions against Cuba. I can also tell you that the sanctions against Cuba are the most comprehensive sanctions in place by the United States today, probably comparable to Iran, but the travel ban is something that exists only in Cuba. So you can travel to North Korea, you can travel to Iran, you can travel anywhere you want, but you cannot travel to Cuba. In the early 90s, Cuba also decided to transform itself. there was no choice. It's not that they wanted to implement the reforms they did implement between 93 and 94, important one, liberalizing reforms, but they had no choice in order to survive. It was a positive development, at least leading Cuba toward a more liberalizing society and a liberalizing economic market. Briefly about US and Cuba relations today. Not good. First of all, almost everything is restricted. So there are restrictions on trade, restriction on investment, restriction on travel. In order to travel to Cuba, you must have a specific license. Some categories of people can go there, like myself, as a full-time professional, for a legitimate purpose of research, I can travel to Cuba. Journalists, some religious activities, but travel is severely curtailed. Trade, there has been a change in 2000. For the first time, the US government allowed food sales to Cuba. Right now, the United States is the first source of food to Cuba. It's selling more food to Cuba than any other country, and we have an embargo in place against Cuba. Mostly bulk products, soybean, corn, wheat, frozen chicken. But when you look at the statistic of Cuba, more food is bought from the United States than from any other country. Some of this regulation, 92, 96, and the 2000 I talked about. In 2004, President Bush decided to increase pressure on Cuba, targeting, for the first time, Cuban Americans. Right now, Cuban American can travel to Cuba only once every 3 years. There is no emergency license, so if you travel to Cuba and your mother will pass away, unfortunately, tomorrow, you cannot go back there legally for the next 3 years. Also, putting more restrictions on remittances. Remittances is the money that Cuban Americans send back to the families in Cuba, which have represented quite an important source of our currency for the Cuban government, which I'm going to talk right now. One of the problems that I see with US policy, this is, by the way, is the stated goal that you can see there. We can discuss if that is really the goal of the United States. But this is what the US policymakers say all the time. We want to hasten a democratic transition in Cuba. In order to do that, we want to deny hard currency resources to the Castro government that can be used to perpetuate the current regime. In 1992, the Torricelli law was specifically devised to curtail the trade that Cuba had with US subsidiaries located all over the world. In fact, that trade did stop almost by the time Cuba decided to open to international tourism and to foreign investment. In 96, the United States went after foreign investment, and they decided to put restriction on companies, foreign companies, that traffic in expropriated properties in Cuba. By that time, the most important source of our currency for Cuba was already remittances, so there was another lifeline for Cuba. In 2004, the United States decided finally to go after remittances by prohibiting Cuban Americans to travel there regularly and to send money there to immediate family members. Now we have a new scenario, Venezuela becoming the lifeline of the Cuban economy. Right now there are 30,000 Cuban professionals, medical professionals in Venezuela. Something around 4 or 5 billion a year are generated by that special agreement that Cuba has with Venezuela. If you look at the statistic of Cuba, the most important export revenues is the export of professional services, meaning doctors, also educators and sports training. So this is where Cuba is getting the money now and the liquidity they need in order to implement the reforms they want to. The other big issue about Cuba and US policy is that does US policy really have anything to do with Cuba? Is there a logic behind US policy? I have a tough time, to be honest, with the logic. I think an economic sanction policy should punish a government when they behave badly and should reward the government when they behave in a more positive way. In the case of Cuba, all the opposite. In the early 90s, Cuba decided finally, also because they had no choice, to stop the relationship with the Soviet Union, to no longer support revolutionary movements. The United States decided to pass more sanctions. 93-94, Cuba implemented significant liberalizing reforms, private initiatives, the legalization of dollar, agricultural cooperatives. It was at least a timid attempt to experience the benefits of some liberalizing reforms. The United States decided to tighten sanctions even more. Then we go 2003. This is a very interesting year. 2003 is when the government, Fidel Castro, cracked down on 75 or 78 dissidents, sending them to prison. That same year, the United States Congress lifted the travel ban. It did lift it in both chambers, same text. Oops. It never made it to the president's desk because by the time the Congress reconvened in early 2004, that particular legislation was no longer on the agenda. But the president would have vetoed the legislation, but never had to do it. So you wonder, they're cracking down on dissidents and you're going to lift the travel ban. They're doing something better, more positive, and you're going to instead increase restriction. Obviously, the role of domestic politics, which is where I'm going with all this reasoning, is very important. I'm not saying that Cuba policy is driven by domestic politics only. There are business interests, political interests. But clearly, domestic politics, referring to the most part, for the most part, of the Cuban-American community, are very important. If we take a look when these sanctions programs, all these sanctions measures passed, always in an electoral year, 92, 96, 2000, and 2004. 2000 was a different case. Clinton was not up for re-election, which is when the United States and Clinton himself signed the law authorizing food sales to Cuba before leaving office. If you remember, that same year, Al Gore was campaigning in favor of keeping the little boy Elian, the one that was found on Thanksgiving Day in the United States, already taking the distance from Clinton. So every presidential campaign year, there's a very important measure on Cuba, which here what is really the main driving factor behind U.S. policy. How much do I have? 4 minutes. 4 minutes, okay. Now, I have a couple of slides only. First of all, latest developments in Cuba. On the part, if you read the newspaper, it looks like that in Cuba nothing is happening. Everything remains the same, same faces, which to a certain extent might be true. There are also important things going on there. First of all, Raúl Castro is now the new president of Cuba. Fidel Castro is writing his own op-ed pieces, let's call it like that, for the Granma newspaper, which is a state-owned newspaper in Cuba, the communist newspaper. Raúl Castro has been implemented quite several reforms, minor reforms I'm saying, but we have to consider Cuba is a country where the state controls 90% of the economy. Some scholars say, well, Cuba is moving eventually toward, in the direction toward the Chinese model. In China, the reform started 30 years ago. In Vietnam, 20 years ago. So it will take a while before Cuba will eventually look, more or less like those countries. But there are important changes. First of all, in the agricultural sector. Raúl Castro has decided to decentralize the sector, to offer more land to Cuban farmers, to pay them more, to provide more incentives. The other part is, probably you read about the recent legalization of air conditioner that you can buy. Although in hard currency, obviously, not many Cubans earn hard currency, actually, very few. Cell phone. The cell phone venture has been legalized a few days ago. Again, hard currency cell phone. The interesting thing about the cell phone venture is that those cell phones receive international calls. Meaning, when you call Cuba, you also generate revenues for the Cuban government. That's how they're going to finance, for the most part, the cell phone venture. So there are important changes in Cuba. The US reaction has been, well, nothing has changed there. They are close to the collapse. We shouldn't be changing our policy now that they are so close to the end, which is questionable. Now, the big issue is not what's going to happen with President Bush, but rather what's going to happen after President Bush leaves office. There are three main candidates by now. I can tell you John McCain has said, nothing's going to change. I'm going to keep the policy in place. Raul Castro, in many respects, is even worse than Fidel Castro. The position of Hillary Clinton has been more in the middle between Obama and McCain, saying, well, I'm not going to change the policy, but if they do something positive, I might be willing to respond to those positive changes. Very vague. Obviously, we still don't know. The position of Obama has been the one that is hoping to break the status quo on Cuba. Obama said, I'm going to revert the 2004 Bush's restrictions on Cuban Americans. The important aspect is that that is as far as a new US president can go on Cuba without the Congress. Since 1996, all sanctions on Cuba are codified into law, meaning you cannot lift the travel ban without Congress. You cannot lift trade restrictions, investment restrictions without Congress. You need Congress practically for everything except the 2004 restrictions, which were put within executive orders, and that's why they can be lifted. So even though Obama might be willing, and I'm trying to speculate, obviously, even for more restriction to be lifted, he will have to rely on Congress, which makes even less likely the restriction will be lifted anytime soon. Quickly, my own view of future US policy. I would say that probably in the short term, those restrictions against Cuban Americans will be lifted, perhaps in 2009. I would also expect other changes eventually in the next administration. Some changes could be on the trade issues, allowing more trade to Cuba, especially make it easier for food producers to sell their products to Cuba. The other part could be oil. Oil can be a major driving factor for a lifting of restrictions, or at least for an exemption only for oil corporation. Cuba is drilling and looking for oil in the Gulf of Mexico waters. If they strike a good quantity of oil, obviously there will be a significant incentive from U.S. oil corporation to lift restriction. And I conclude with my comment saying, well, in terms of future U.S. policy, complete lifting of the embargo, we still have to wait a while. It will all depend how long both Fidel and Raul Castro will live. The Helms-Burton Law 96 specifically states that one condition for lifting the embargo is that both Fidel and Raul are gone. So no matter what Raul will be doing, the full embargo will be lifted only when both Castro brothers will be out of the picture. Thank you.
I'm a business journalist, so I'm not a financial regulator. I'm not an academic, and I'm certainly not an accountant. But my job is to try to make sure that people in our community can understand what's happening in the financial markets, how that's affecting our daily lives, our local businesses, and especially right now, what this presidential election is going to mean in some of those areas. And it's really, really becoming a big deal. And anyone who just looks at the headlines in the newspaper or catches the 11 o'clock news, you're certainly going to pick up on that. I have a lot of people tell me when I speak at things like this, they say, hey, I don't really understand how the stock market works. I don't really understand a lot about how the U.S. regulates its financial markets. I don't know a lot about business, etc. And, that may be true. I mean, not everyone has to be an expert in those areas. But one thing that is almost always certain is almost everyone is an investor on some level. And that means that everyone has a stake in this presidential election, certainly, and in some of the reforms we are now starting to hear about. And a lot of that has been brought on, in large part, by the current financial crisis that we're seeing in the markets here in the U.S., globally, the tightening credit markets, home foreclosures, all of the things you're probably hearing about in the news. So because everyone is an investor, whether if you have a 401k, or most of you when you graduate you probably will, or you have mutual funds that your parents helped you invest in, or your grandmother bought you a bond when you were 8 years old, whatever the case may be, everyone has a stake in this process. And it's for that core reason that the economy, like the Iraq War, which is another issue that almost everyone has a stake in. I mean, we're getting to a point where almost everyone knows someone or is acquainted with somebody in some way who has been directly impacted by the Iraq War. Either they have a friend or someone who's serving there, or possibly has been injured or killed. So it's for that reason that those two issues are going to be the big headlines as we continue forward here for the remainder of the presidential election. Now, there are a couple of points I wanted to make, and today is such an appropriate day to be giving a talk like this because, today, as we all sit here in the Student Union, the Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson, is actually laying out his ideas for reform for the, regulating the financial markets here, regulating companies, businesses, the way we do business. And, let's face it, obviously, business makes the world go round. And these are really striking reforms. This is the most sweeping proposals we've seen since probably shortly after the Great Depression, although there were some new policies put into place after the 19 stock market crash as well. But this is really big, and there's a couple takeaway points that I want to kind of emphasize today for those of you who, you may not be following every twist and turn of this. As students, you may not be, super interested in the financial news, but it is something that eventually, as you begin, heading out into the workforce and starting your own families and saving for your own retirement, I mean, these are all issues that you're going to want to keep in mind, obviously. We don't know a lot about the details of the reforms that have been laid out so far. Some of it kind of trickled out over the weekend, and today we're hearing more about it in the news as Paulson tries to get his message out. One of the big headlines that keeps getting repeated is that there's this idea that we could create this super for the financial markets, someone who could really come in and be an enforcer of rules and policies. That might mean that maybe the Securities and Exchange Commission would go away. Maybe its role and powers would change. There's a lot up in the air right now, and this is all, it's going to be really, really interesting to watch how it plays out, especially during an election year. Now, because it's an election year, however, no one is expecting any of this to happen right now. In fact, Paulson was quoted in the Wall Street Journal this morning saying basically, hey, I know that with Hillary and Barack Obama still fighting it out on the Democratic side and McCain, trying to do everything he can for votes, none of this is going to get settled. Certainly Bush is not going to take this in his final months in office. But I guess the point Paulson is trying to make is that these are the issues we should be aware of, and these are the kinds of things that the next president and the next Congress should be thinking about when it comes to financial markets. The other big issue at play is that, I think that at the federal level, they're worried about criticism. Listen, if we start talking about all these sweeping reform changes right now and don't actually address the problem at hand, which is, again, the mortgage crisis, the tightening credit markets, then, we're going to be off task and really missing the mark. So a lot of these issues are going to play out really over the next probably 18 months, and it is going to be extremely interesting what these guys do. you all should care, because if you own stock, even just for fun or just, experimentally in anything, whether it's Disney or Darden restaurants, or Tupperware brands or whatever you might choose. I'm just naming some local companies that you all might be familiar with. These regulations do impact what you are allowed to know about the companies, the rights shareholders have. So that's one issue to also keep in mind as you're watching the news play out. Now, there is a camp as well, and it's not to be discounted, that really what the U.S. needs is less financial regulation, that the amount of financial regulation we have right now is holding us back from competing against other global markets such as Hong Kong or London or what have you. Some in the Bush administration who feel that way, and that is, that's going to be a side that we're probably going to hear a lot from even after this current president is out of office. So I guess just to close my opening remarks, I would just say that don't underestimate the impact of all of these economic discussions on the presidential race. Again, as we sit here, there appears to be more and more pressure mounting for Hillary Clinton to drop out of the race. I don't know that she'll do that. It seems like, from watching everything she's done so far, that she's really not willing to do that right now. But more people, more Democrats are throwing their support behind Barack Obama, and if he emerges as the candidate, it'll be important to hear what he has on these issues.
Wondering what you think the impact of the Bank of the South, the bank that Chavez is trying to make work, if that experiment works, what effect that'll have on the IMF, World Bank, and the U.S.?
For the time being, that project with the Bank of the South has just started. It's hard to tell what would be the impact, the long-term impact. I think the big issue is not the Bank of the South, but rather what kind of relationship Cuba will keep with Venezuela under Raúl Castro as compared to Fidel Castro. We know for sure that Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, have been very close. Some scholars speculate that Raúl Castro may not be that close. To me, the most important thing about the Bank of the South, the ALBA, the alternative, Bolivarian alternative for the Americas, the alternative to the free trade areas of the Americas, is really how close Cuba is becoming with Venezuela and how Venezuela is supporting the Cuban economy, which ties Venezuela also with the United States on a conflictual path because of that, among other reasons. I mentioned before that there are right now, the most important source of our currency for Cuba is the doctors they're providing to Venezuela, receiving preferential terms for oil, all kind of benefits. So I would say that Bank of the South could be an alternative for Cuba in the short term to the IMF, the World Bank, and other financial institutions that can provide credit to Cuba. It can be. In the long run, I would wait to make the assessment on a more long-term basis.
A lot of Americans in 2004 voted for president on the basis of the Iraq War. They reasoned voting for either President Bush or John Kerry because of the Iraq War. Do you think the Iraq War is going to be the bigger issue in this election right now, or do you think it's going to be the and the U.S. economy, because that is becoming a bigger concern now that the housing markets are falling and the recession is starting to wear down Americans?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's really hard to pick one over the other there, because both of those issues are so important. And one of the points I was trying to make earlier is that both of those issues, we're getting to a point now where almost everyone can feel a direct effect. Whether your business or your home loan has been affected by the financial crisis, or whether you've got neighbors and friends and loved ones who are affected by Iraq. I mean, I think that's why I think both of those issues are going to be the cornerstones of this election. So, gosh, it's going to be hard to pick one over the other, but I would not underestimate the the impact of the economy, especially if we find in the next quarterly reportings that we are, the thing about a recession, everyone likes to talk about, are we in a recession, or, are we not? The thing about a recession is you never know if you were technically in one until time has already passed that you were. It's just the way a recession is measured and defined. So if we start finding out here by this time the summer reports come out that in fact GDP is down, we are in the negative, then yeah, it's probably going to rise even further.
As you noted, the recession is defined as negative GDP growth, and we won't know if we're in a recession until middle of July, I think, would be the earliest we could know. But of course, recession can take place in a local economy as well. Do you have any sense of the Orlando situation or Central Florida? Do you feel that this area is feeling that, do we have negative growth in this area?
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly in the housing market, definitely negative growth there. And because of that, a lot of small businesses are feeling the ripple effect. A lot of consumer spending is down in a lot of ways. But as you know, our local economy is heavily reliant on two big industries, and that's tourism and defense. And so, so happens that the Iraq War, as terrible as some of those effects have been for a lot of people, have brought a lot of business to Lockheed Martin, to Harris Corp, to the simulation businesses here that are associated even with the University of Central Florida. So those businesses tend to be faring okay. We've seen their earnings. We've seen them increase the number of contracts and the amount of the contracts that they've been able to get over the last few months even. And tourism also seems to be holding its own right now. The parks, especially the big three, Disney, Universal, and SeaWorld, have come out with new attractions that have given people, incentive to come here and to come here repeatedly. We've got Universal building a huge attraction surrounded on the Harry Potter theme. That's expected to be huge if they execute that well, and if people who really like Harry Potter and really know Harry Potter stuff, if they find that attraction to be interesting, then that's going to be a big boost for Universal. One thing I'm concerned about with the theme parks, though, are gas prices. Gas prices, everybody's affected by that. We've all seen the hit to our wallets in terms of what happens when we go to fill up tanks each time. A lot of people I know don't even fill it all the way up to the F. They put it at the halfway mark. That is a big deal because the parks are heavily reliant on people who drive here. Not everyone flies to Orlando for their Disney vacation. A lot of people drive here, especially from throughout the Southeast and from throughout the rest of Florida. And it's often the case that when we see gas prices go up, that people want to drive shorter distances and stay closer to home and perhaps just go to the coast for their vacation, maybe spend a couple days at the beach versus the theme park. So those are things we have to keep an eye on. But all the numbers we're seeing out of the parks so far are that their attendance is doing great. Aquatica, the new SeaWorld water park that actually just kind of had its official open this month. I mean, they've had to shut down the parking lot like 4 or 5 times, I believe now. The place was so crowded. So, because of those two main industries, I mean, I don't think Central Florida is in a full-out recession.
I'm wondering, the Cuban public, how are they reacting to Raul as their new leader? Culturally, how have they adapted, agreed, or optimistic about him ruling their country? And is there any speculation on who may be the next leader after Raul?
Yes, I was to Cuba twice since Fidel relinquished power at the end of July 2006. First of all, in Cuba, when things happen, it's not like you're gonna, they will just tell you, perhaps at night, a brief official speech on television, and they will say, well, the ministers will be replaced by new one, or the president will be replaced temporarily by new one. Obviously, anyone in Cuba knew part of the Cuban Constitution that Raúl Castro will be the leader when Fidel Castro is no longer around. The interesting part about that, there are two issues. One is for the Cuban population, the other is for the U.S. policy. Briefly on U.S. policy, that kind of scenario that is occurring right now in Cuba was probably never taken into consideration. The idea was always, well, one day Fidel Castro his ego is so big that he would just relinquish power the day he will die. And then his brother will take the reign of Cuba, and something will happen eventually. People will revolt, or there's going to be a major problem. Obviously, Fidel Castro had to relinquish power. He would have not done it. But the Cubans have accepted the transition. That doesn't mean they like everything. Obviously, there are many, many problems. Cubans worry about many things. Democracy is one of those. But they also worry first and most about their being able to provide for their families, which is why Raúl Castro has been promoting first a national debate among all Cubans, discussing what are the suggestions for improving the system. He himself, very critical about the system, saying that, well, obviously there are structural changes that must be done. And also we have to admit that he's going to do reforms, small and gradual reforms, because he wants to keep popular support. This is the time that Cubans are also demanding changes. So I would say that the transition so far has been, the level of acceptation among people has been good. That doesn't mean they don't aspire for something different leader. In my opinion, if there's going to be a new leader, at least formally within the current regime, would be the Vice President of Cuba, Carlos Lage, which was supposed to be the new president, according to some scholars, in a way, including myself, when there was a reshuffle of the Council of State a month and a half ago. That reshuffle led to the old guard, the old communist guard, and the military becoming even more important, in even more important position of power. I think the idea is really we have to do reforms, but we also have to control those reforms and making sure they will not unleash any sort of unexpected consequences. So in that optic has to be seen the old guard and the military becoming, at least in formal position, more powerful. But I would say probably the next one would be Carlos Lage, definitely.
We in Florida are given the impression that a lot of our policies vis-a-vis Cuba are driven by the sentiments and the sensibilities of the Cuban Americans who live in the southern part of Florida. In your opinion, how much influence does that group really have on our political system?
Okay, good question. Controversial one. I always talk about the role of domestic politics in U.S.-Cuba policy. I want to make clear this is not the only reason why we have that policy. There are also business interests important. If we understand also how important is Florida, and when the economic sanctions against Cuba have passed, I would say definitely a major role. But even within the community, the Cuban-American community, there is a change. We are not talking about a monolithic group where everyone looks at U.S. policy the same way. The newcomers, mostly the one who came to the United States after the last big wave of migrants in '94, tend to support, and there are polls out there, a relaxation of sanctions against Cuba. They would like to travel there to send money to their family, not to be told who is their family member, whether a cousin is not part of an immediate family member. Overall, I would say definitely the domestic politics is a very important component. I wouldn't compress all U.S. policy as the role of the Cuban-American community, but I cannot exclude that there is a very important one, definitely. Which is, I always talk about that, and obviously some people don't like that part, but it's an important part. And even one thing that I want to mention briefly, the Helms-Burton Law in '96, thinking about the role of domestic politics. The Helms-Burton Law of '96 goes after foreign companies that traffic in Cuba, in U.S. expropriated properties. Not only U.S. expropriated properties, but also in properties that were expropriated to Cubans who became U.S. citizens later. So practically their rights are recognized even though when they suffer an expropriation, they were not U.S. citizens at that time. And not a single company of the original companies, the original claimants, lobbied in favor of the Helms-Burton Law. So we have wonder who's behind the law and who is the main factor. So I would say, well, it's obvious.
With the growing pain of oil prices going up all the time, and it seems to be no stop to an end, is there anything the federal government can do to lessen the prices without finding an alternative source of fuel?
Well, you know, there are a couple things. I mean, I guess the latest today is, I think oil was trading around $105 a barrel. I think there had been some concerns about supply and demand that now have not really come to fruition over the last week. So we've seen a slight drop in oil prices. That doesn't, however, it's a complicated situation. The oil prices are not directly linked to what you pay at the gas pump. A lot of people have a misconception about that. But federal government do. You know, it depends on who's in charge of the federal government in a lot of ways, because you know, there's a big argument and a good argument to be made to just let the markets kind of discipline themselves and let market forces really set the prices. There's a lot of controversy about oil policy and about where oil is coming from, and you know, what's been going on behind the scenes to really impact and influence a lot of that. I mean, that's certainly the case. I tend to not buy into a lot of the conspiracy theories and things that are circulating out there. But you know, oil is going to continue to be a huge factor for the U.S. and you mentioned finding alternative sources. That's probably one of the biggest. That's probably going to be one of the biggest influencers over the next decade or so, is how effective those alternative sources become. If they do become effective and they're cost efficient, then obviously you're going to see some downward pressure on oil prices.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dallas.